It was Christmas Eve, but the mood in the Wick household was far from festive. David Wick had taken the week off from his job as a cook to visit his cousin Ben, who lived in a remote cabin in Montana. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine hung heavy in the woods surrounding the cabin. Snow blanketed the ground, glistening under a sunny sky. David had grown up in the Midwest, a place where winters were harsh but familiar. Montana, though, it was wild, untamed, a different kind of cold that seemed to seep into your bones. David, Ben, and their two friends, Lisa and Eric, were gathered around the fireplace that evening. The cabin was modest but cozy, decked out in simple Christmas decorations, a small tree in the corner, a few garlands strung along the walls, and stockings hanging above the mantel. They were laughing, sipping hot chocolate, and reminiscing about past holidays when the first sign of trouble came. It started as a soft thud against the side of the cabin. Wind must have knocked something over, Ben said, rising to check. But the air outside was calm, the only movement the lazy drift of snowflakes falling from the trees. Ben returned, shrugging. Nothing out there. A few minutes later, the thud came again, louder this time. David felt a prickle of unease. He'd heard stories growing up, tales of creatures that roamed the woods, especially in remote areas like this. Some said it was a bear, others a mountain lion. But there were also whispers of something else, something older and far more dangerous. Bigfoot. Lisa laughed nervously. Maybe it's Santa? Or Krampus, Eric muttered, half joking. They tried to shake off the tension, but the noises continued, scraping against the walls, faint knocks on the windows. David's stomach tightened. He remembered the old rumors about Bigfoot, a towering figure covered in dark, matted fur, with glowing red eyes and an unearthly howl. Some said it was intelligent, even cruel, toying with its prey before striking. When they heard a low, guttural growl outside, everyone froze. "What the hell was that?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Ben grabbed his rifle, motioning for the others to stay put. He opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the snow. David followed, clutching a flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of moonlight on the snow. "Probably just an animal," Ben said, though his voice lacked conviction. They returned inside, bolting the door. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an oppressive weight pressing down on all of them. The thuds grew louder, more deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted them to know it wasn't leaving. Around midnight, they decided to build a fire outside, hoping it might deter whatever was stalking them. The flames cast flickering shadows across the snow, and they sat huddled together, weapons close at hand. David's thoughts drifted to his family back home. His mom had always loved Christmas, filling their small house with the smell of cookies and the sound of holiday music. He wondered if she'd notice his absence this year, or if she'd assume he was too busy with work. The thought made his chest ache. A sudden, sharp crack snapped him back to the present. A tree branch, heavy with snow, had broken and fallen nearby, or so they thought. Then they saw it, a hulking silhouette just beyond the firelight. The creature stepped closer, its massive frame partially obscured by the trees. Its eyes glowed red, and its breath steamed in the frigid air. David's pulse quickened. It was just as the stories described, but worse. Far worse. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, and the way it moved, slow and deliberate, sent a chill down his spine. "Back inside," Ben hissed, and they scrambled toward the cabin. The creature didn't follow immediately. Instead, it circled the perimeter, its growls low and menacing. It slapped the walls with enough force to shake the cabin, and when it finally attacked, it was swift and brutal. It smashed one of the windows, reaching inside with a massive clawed hand. Lisa screamed, and Ben fired his rifle, the sound deafening in the confined space. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, retreating into the shadows. "We can't stay here," David said, his voice shaking. "It's just toying with us." They gathered what supplies they could, knives, flashlights, and a first aid kit, and bolted out the door. The creature pursued them, its heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. They ran through the woods, the beam of David's flashlight bouncing wildly. Eric stumbled, letting out a cry as the creature closed in. Ben turned and fired again, giving Eric enough time to get back on his feet. They didn't stop to see if the shots landed, they just kept running. The woods seemed endless, every shadow a potential hiding spot for the creature. But eventually they reached the main road. Headlights appeared in the distance, and they flagged down a passing truck. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, didn't ask questions. He just opened the door and motioned for them to get in. As they sped away, David looked back at the woods. For a moment, he thought he saw the creature standing at the edge of the trees, watching them with its glowing eyes. But then it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The ride back to town was silent. No one spoke of what they'd seen, but the fear lingered in their eyes. David knew he'd never forget that Christmas Eve in Montana and the creature that had turned their holiday into a nightmare. Nick Oldman had always loved the solitude of hiking. It was his way of escaping the relentless buzz of retail work in Denver, where days blurred into a constant hum of impatient customers, fluorescent lights, and the endless beeping of registers. When his vacation rolled around, he decided to head to Michigan, drawn by its dense forests and the promise of quiet. He'd read about the trails near Sleeping Bear Dunes, but chose a more secluded spot inland, away from the crowds. The day was muggy, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Nick set out early, his pack light but well prepared. His family had always joked about his knack for overpacking: flashlights, knives, a first aid kit, even a small emergency whistle. Better to have it and not need it, his father used to say, a sentiment that stuck with Nick through the years. By late afternoon, the weather began to shift. Dark clouds rolled in, and a warm drizzle turned the dirt path into a slick ribbon of mud. Nick found a clearing near a small stream to set up camp, deciding to hunker down for the night. As he pitched his tent and lit a small fire, memories of his childhood filtered in. His dad teaching him how to tie knots, his mom's stories about Michigan's wildlife, some real, others tinged with folklore. One tale, in particular, lingered. A lumbering, shadowy figure stalking the woods. Bigfoot. Nick had laughed it off then, but the idea stuck with him, its improbability strangely magnetic. He'd watched countless YouTube videos dissecting grainy footage and shaky testimonies, intrigued by the mystery of it all. Tonight, as the rain fell steadily and the forest darkened, the stories felt a little too close for comfort. As the fire crackled and the rain drummed against his tarp, Nick thought he heard a distant snap, a branch breaking. He froze, straining his ears. The forest was alive with the usual symphony of insects and frogs, but this sound was different, heavy, deliberate. Probably just a deer, he muttered to himself, though his grip tightened on the knife at his side. The sound came again, closer this time. A low growl rumbled through the trees, barely audible over the rain, but unmistakable. Nick's pulse quickened. He aimed his flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the light, something moved, a massive shape, tall and broad, its fur matted and dark. His breath caught. It was Bigfoot, or something like it. The creature stood motionless, its glowing eyes reflecting the firelight. It watched him, unblinking, before melting back into the shadows. Nick's first instinct was to pack up and run, but the rain and the creature's sheer size pinned him in place. He doused the fire quickly, plunging the campsite into darkness, hoping the creature would lose interest. But it didn't. For hours, it prowled around the clearing, its guttural growls and heavy footfalls a constant reminder of its presence. Sleep was impossible. Nick stayed awake, clutching his knife, his mind racing with every possible escape route. By dawn, the rain had eased to a misty drizzle, but the creature hadn't left. Nick decided to move. Staying put was no longer an option. As he packed, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A human scream, sharp and panicked, echoing through the forest. It wasn't his imagination. Someone else was out here. Against every instinct, he ran toward the sound, his boots slipping on the muddy ground. He found a woman, battered and wide-eyed, tied to a tree with strips of bark. Her clothes were torn and she was shivering, barely coherent. "It's coming back," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "We have to go." Nick cut her free, adrenaline surging. Together, they stumbled through the woods, the creature's howls chasing them. It was toying with them, closing the distance only to fall back again, herding them deeper into the forest. At one point, the woman tripped, spraining her ankle. Nick hoisted her over his shoulder, the weight slowing him down but not stopping him. They reached a narrow ravine and scrambled across a fallen log, the creature's growls growing louder behind them. On the other side, Nick spotted a faint trail, overgrown but recognizable. It led to a small village, its lights a beacon of safety. They burst out of the woods, gasping and soaked, startling a farmer loading hay onto a truck. The creature didn't follow. It lingered at the edge of the trees, watching, before retreating into the shadows. The farmer drove them to the nearest town, where they recounted their story to skeptical authorities. There were no calls to the police. What could they say? That Bigfoot had stalked them through the woods? They'd be dismissed as delusional or worse. Nick never went back to those woods. He returned to Denver, his perspective on the unknown forever changed. The forest, once a place of peace and adventure, now held a darker edge. He couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes or the woman's terror. He wondered if anyone else would believe them, or if the creature would find its next victim hidden in the depths of Michigan's endless trees. Arthur Bean had seen plenty of weird things during his years on the road. As a trucker out of Poughkeepsie, he'd come across odd roadside attractions, met strange drifters, and even encountered the occasional ghost story told by fellow drivers over late-night coffee stops. But nothing had prepared him for what he and his friends experienced one Christmas Eve in the heart of Maine. The group was heading north, driving through snow-laden roads to deliver some last-minute holiday cheer to a mutual friend. Arthur, used to long-haul trips, had offered to drive. With him were Jake, a mechanic with a dry sense of humor, and Lisa, a sharp-witted artist who had insisted they detour through Maine for the scenic views. Arthur warned her the winter weather wouldn't make for much sightseeing, but Lisa had insisted. As they pulled into a gas station off Route 27, the wind howled, bending the skeletal trees that framed the station. It was a lonely outpost, the type of place you only stopped at because you had no other choice. A flickering neon sign above the pumps read Earl's Gas and Goods. Arthur parked by the pump, stepping out into the biting cold to fill the tank. The wind carried a strange sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from the nearby woods. Arthur paused, looking toward the dense pines. "Did you hear that?" Lisa asked, leaning out the window. "It's probably just the wind," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. Arthur wasn't so sure. He'd watched his fair share of YouTube videos about cryptids and folklore during downtime at truck stops. This kind of eerie, desolate setting was the perfect backdrop for something out of those stories. Inside the station, the atmosphere was no less unsettling. The clerk, a wiry man with a patchy beard, barely looked up from his newspaper as they entered. The shelves were half-stocked with dusty snacks and canned goods. Lisa picked up a map, and Arthur grabbed a coffee. "Anything strange around here?" Arthur asked the clerk casually, testing the waters. The man raised an eyebrow. "Strange? Just the usual. Bears, coyotes, maybe worse things if you believe the old-timers." Arthur didn't press. He could tell the clerk wasn't in a talkative mood. Back outside, as they loaded into the car, the growling returned, closer this time. The sound was joined by a snapping of branches, heavy and deliberate. Arthur felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. Suddenly, from the edge of the tree line, something massive moved. Its silhouette was monstrous, tall and hunched, with glowing yellow eyes that pierced the darkness. Lisa gasped, fumbling for her phone, but Arthur barked, "Get in the car!" Before they could, the creature let out an ear-splitting howl and lunged forward. Its claws raked across the hood, leaving deep gouges. Arthur threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on the icy pavement as the creature bared its fangs and roared. They sped away, but the creature followed, its shadowy form bounding alongside the car, keeping pace. "What the hell is that thing?" Jake shouted, gripping the dashboard. Arthur didn't answer. His mind raced with fragments of stories, tales of werewolves, cursed men doomed to prowl the woods in search of prey. The creatures slammed into the side of the car, nearly sending them into a ditch. Arthur veered onto a narrow side road, hoping to lose it in the maze of snow-covered trees. They skidded to a stop in a small clearing, the car's engine sputtering. "We can't stay here," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "It'll find us." But running blind through the woods was just as dangerous. Arthur grabbed a flare gun from the trunk, one of his emergency supplies, and led them deeper into the forest. They built a quick fire to keep warm and sat huddled around it, listening to the wind and the occasional snap of distant branches. Arthur's thoughts drifted to his family. Christmas Eve had always been a big deal growing up. His mom would make her famous pot roast, and his dad would tell stories, real ones, not the tall tales Arthur heard on the road. He wondered what they'd think of him now, hiding in the woods from a creature out of legend. The firelight danced across the snow, casting eerie shadows. The wind carried faint noises, footsteps, breathing. It was impossible to tell. Arthur gripped the flare gun tightly, his other hand resting on the knife he always kept on him. When the attack came, it was sudden. The creature barreled out of the darkness, its claws swiping at Jake. Arthur fired the flare, the bright light momentarily stunning the beast. "Run!" he shouted, pulling Lisa to her feet. They stumbled through the woods, slipping on ice and tripping over roots. Jake lagged behind, his screams cutting through the night as the creature dragged him back into the shadows. Arthur wanted to go back, but Lisa pulled him forward, tears streaming down her face. Finally, they burst onto the main road, flagging down a passing snowplow. The driver, wide-eyed and disbelieving, let them climb in. They didn't look back as they sped toward town. At the police station, their story was met with skepticism. "Probably a bear," one officer said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe it either. Arthur knew better. He'd seen the eyes, the claws, the sheer malice of the thing. Arthur and Lisa never spoke of that night again. But every Christmas Eve, when the wind howled outside, Arthur couldn't help but remember the creature's growl and the snow-streaked woods of Maine.